Thank you very much. Thank you for Cardoso Foundation inviting me. As Sergio already mentioned, I met Fernando Higgy 10 years ago. We're hanging around quite a bit in some wonderful Chinese restaurants in Washington, and I heard a lot of stories when he meeting Chinese leaders. Now, I'm really happy to be here, precisely because I'm recently also invited, I told Sergio, to participate in a Brookings Institution project on China, what the title is called Chinese Expansion in Latin America, which is typical American language. Of course, they worried a lot. So I will be part of the team working on, from the China point of view. But here, I'm trying to explain China itself instead of explaining China and the Latin American relations. The topic today is on challenges that Chinese leadership, the new leadership, are facing today and how they deal with it. To start this my presentation, I think I must first of all explain that what Chinese leadership really is all about, this new generation, so-called the fifth generation of leadership, which is a very unique generation. It is a generation, I would argue, there is no president, there is no after generation which it's had the same experience. It's very, very unique. This is a generation who were born, the first generation leadership who were born after the revolution, in their mid-50s, and then they have experienced most of the ups and downs of the tumultuous events of the PRC, the history of People's Republic of China. And when they were, well, it's my generation, so I very much identify with them. I actually know a couple of them. We went to high school together even. So what is interesting is that we are the generation, post-war, post-revolution generation, but we start our life, the early life, with a terrible event in China, which is called the Great Leap Forward. Because at that time we were only in kindergarten, and suddenly starvation is spreading all over China. As you know, that particular disaster of the People's Republic cost us somewhere between 35 to 50 million people because of the bad economic decisions. That's 3 years of so-called Great Leap Forward. And then we have a few years of tranquility between the early 60s until the 66. Once again, we are supposed to be close to high school age, then all schools are closed. And we're entering another major violent period of a so-called Cultural Revolution. And this is another 10 years of upheaval where university closed and high school later is open, but there is no regular curriculum for education. And most of us, my generation, who participate in the early stage of Cultural Revolution, were kicked out of the cities, and we are forced to go to the countryside for what Mao would call it a re-education program. So most of the current leaders, I'm talking about the leaders at the provincial governor level, ministerial level, vice minister, vice prime minister, and the premier himself, and Xi Jinping, the top leader. For the Politburo, altogether, more than half had the same experience, who were re-educated in the countryside, like myself. I was sent down for 4 years from age 17, and I survived for 4 years. Then we returned to the university. We already, for the first year college, I was already 21. But Xi Jinping spent 6 years, and the Premier Li Keqiang, whom we went in the same city, the high school, he was there also for 4 years. Okay. So this is a generation who've been through so much. Then, of course, our experience is that this generation have seen the bottom of the society. That's very important in my view. They were sent to the poorest area in the country. The place I went is known as the Siberia of China. We all work for 13 to 14 hours a day, probably get less than $50 a day. We all survived in the end. But we are more affiliated with the local population. We began to see what the majority of the Chinese people are living. So this is a group of leadership, I think, it's unique in the sense they have a first-hand knowledge about the bottom of the society. Then after the Cultural Revolution, they rose through the ranks. They began to see every level of the problem of the Chinese society. So this is a very, in my view, pragmatic generation who also much more open to the international society than previous generation like Jiang Zemin and the Hu Jintao generation, or the later generation, today's younger generation who are born into prosperity, or internet generation who know nothing about Great Leap Forward, starvation, poverty. So this is, you know, at outset, I want to emphasize this is very different generation. Whether this generation can lead us into great success the next 5 or 10 years, it's another question. Can they do it? Now, what challenges they're facing today? I think internally, I would argue the current generation leadership, the fifth generation, is facing the most severe crisis of legitimacy of the regime since 1949. When I say crisis of legitimacy, means the regime, it may be counterintuitive. The regime seemed to be able to uplifting so many people out of poverty in the last 30 years with their successful economic development strategies, yet the one-party system is losing in terms of the legitimacy. Why this is the case? Why this is the case? Now, I think the reason for this political crisis in China is not what it looks like from the outside, or the Western press would portray that its legitimacy is always an issue of democratic legitimacy, meaning we don't have a democratic system, therefore the regime automatically has never acquired legitimacy to begin with. No, that's not what our crisis really is. The crisis is caused by the Chinese society, or the leadership included. We are returning back to our traditional value system. This is a national effort of a restoration. Now here I want to emphasize the most misleading concept in the West about China the last 30 years is the media phrase called the rise of China. This is the most misleading phrase. Rise of China indicate two things. One is this is something new. The second is it depicts a phenomenon says why China rises? Because China finally embraced Western value systems such as market principle and so on. Even though politically we're still behind, but inevitably democratization will, follow. Okay, this is what Robert Zoellick and many other American policymakers pointing out. This is inevitable. This development, but that's not true. It's ahistorical, and from a Chinese leadership point of view, the current economic development level, or whatever you call it, economic miracle of China, has not been something new. It's a déjà vu, and the Chinese certainly have seen that before. Now, what is new? Trade surplus. Now, Chinese throughout history never had trade deficit. Until 1840s, they don't have trade. Chinese are the ones who create first real international market, which they try to revive now, so-called Silk Road. if you follow Chinese leadership statement very carefully. That's the Silk Road through ocean, Silk Road through land, okay? And we never had a deficit, so it's always surplus. We're not used to the trade deficit until after the British using military force against China during the 1840s, so-called Opium War. The second, supposed to be something new, is the extraordinary amount of hard currency the Chinese banking system accumulated. Now, that's nothing new either, because that's primarily the reason British went to war with China in the 1840s, because we were sucking in the whole world hard currency at the time. We're having a silver standard at the time, and so we're sucking in all of the world, including the newly discovered Mexican silver, as you know, why the silver production increased so much, which lead to the British decision, well, the gold standard and so on and so forth. And GDP, which is another thing. GDP, according to OECD's massive study of a world economy of a 1,000-year history, the GDP data is that 1830s, that is before British invade China, Chinese GDP relative position, 32.9% of the global economy at that point, despite the British Industrial Revolution, European taking off. Europeans are the emerging market, those days, don't forget. That is something they call us the BRICS, emerging market, emergence, whatever. So, today, despite all the outcry of Chinese economy causing major global economic imbalance because the trade surplus, because the hard currency, how much do you think Chinese economy is a relative position today? What percentage Chinese economy today is? Was still less than 10%. So if you're sitting in Beijing, the Chinese leadership will think, well, there is no rise to that. What we need to do is restore. We still have 20-some% to restore, just in pure economic terms, not to mention cultural and value restoration. So Chinese leadership only use expression, national restoration. Okay. They never used the expression rise of China to begin with. So that, as you can see, the misperception from the very beginning to what is the narrative of the recent phenomenon of Chinese economic development. Okay. And so this is, I think, is the Chinese perception. Now, having said that, I start with the concept of crisis. What crisis then, since we're supposedly being, last 30 years so successful? The crisis is that as we restoring our traditional value system, which is Confucian political philosophy. What is Confucian philosophy? Which is it's a political thought that governance must be based on leadership's moral behavior. This has been our tradition for a couple of thousand years. It is an ethical interpretation of politics. Chinese never developed a scientific or whatever you call it, mechanical way of thinking about politics, as Montesquieu would later summarize as divisions of power, which is, of course, emphasized on spatial divisions. They divide politics into several sections, therefore you can divide. But Chinese political thinking has always been legitimacy issue is a process where if the leadership behave correctly in moral terms. Now, what happened is that the last 30 years, despite economic success, the leadership misbehaved. That is, not only they abused the power they have, but also create the largest scale of wealth transfer, not through market forces, but through power play. This is the roots of the widespread official corruption in China. Now, for some 20 years, leadership under Jiang Zemin, the leader under Hu Jintao, did nothing. I think they mostly afraid of the breaking through the barrier or the obstacles of the interest groups, and I'm sure couple of top leaders in the past are very much corrupt themselves, or their family very much corrupted. So we are entering a period when the new leadership, the younger generation came to power, who had no direct link to revolution itself, even though they have a link to their parental generation. But they are the people who are began to realize that we have to rescue, if you want to rescue the legitimacy of the system, the first priority, domestic priority, is to deal with the widespread corruption. It is only this leadership, if you follow the last 2 years Chinese politics, they really launched this is not a political purge campaign as the Stalinist system used to do, to use anti-corruption simply to get rid of political opponents. This is really a systematic effort of getting rid of the roots of official corruption. And at this stage, it's very risky because the enormous resistance, because so many people who had vested interest. We're talking about Politburo members, their families, top leaders, or the retired top leaders. So it's not easy. But my thinking is that Mr. Xi and his colleagues are determined on that. We are arresting something like 10 to 15 top officials every day. Every day, if you follow our press. So it's very, it's not something we should take lightly. Now, I understand every system has corruption. But this is, I must argue, one-party system sometimes has one advantage. They can smash through if they determine to do something. While in the other system, probably I understand, including the Brazilian system, it's not so easy. Democracy could be very chaotic in that sense. When you try to make some decisive decisions.
We are flexing our muscles.
Okay, I really hope so. I really hope so. Really. Now, so this is the biggest, in my view, political risk the Chinese are facing. Now, will that be successful? Okay, I think what they're trying to do, not only using political power to get rid of the corrupt officials, but they also began to use legal power. And for the first time, the People's Republic started legal reform, which was last month. Regrettably, Western press paid absolutely no attention to that. They think it makes no sense, it's no breakthrough. They did not realize that for a one-party system to actually attempt at some kind of create a semi-autonomous legal procedure, which is what this recent reform is all about. Create a circuit courts, separate from the party decisions. As a first step, I think, in my lifetime in People's Republic, that's a major breakthrough. For me, it's unheard of. With a legal procedure, try to help to make the anti-corruption campaign more within proper due procedure. See, this is the whole idea. Yeah. Economic challenge is clear. We all know that Chinese economy is in decline, and certainly growth is very, very much slower. We need structural changes, but I'm less worried about structural changes, success or not, because they are doing it aggressively. Structural change in this case of China, meaning they try to transform our economy from export-dependent economy into consumer, domestic consumer-dependent economy. They already done quite a bit to foster the success in that direction. Personally, well, we can discuss it. Q&A if you want to know more detail about each sector. We can discuss more. But I'm more confident in macroeconomic politics than in its politics of economic reform, which again is difficult now. And the corruption campaign I already mentioned, but there is another thing I want to emphasize, which is not always understood by outsiders. Why Chinese are fanatic with this idea of 7-some-A% GDP growth? Now, for other countries, maybe even for Brazil, 4% probably is not so bad. For India, Indian colleagues told me even 1%, they're okay. Europeans, 0.5%, they're happy. Americans too, it's okay. Why Chinese are so obsessed with this defending a 7 to 8% GDP growth? here, I think it's not economics, it is politics here, or social political issue. This is issue caused by what I just mentioned, widespread official corruption, which created in the last 30 years a huge income gap. The Gini index, which is a measure of, the Gini index among the highest in the world for China. Now, what does it mean? Gini index says if that gap is so big, you create social instability, also lead to political instability. We have a mass demonstration, probably at least 100 or so a month in China, not always reported for protesting this, protesting that, for unhappiness. But the key thing here is, according to Chinese policy leaders, we have to maintain something between 7.5 to 8% to create what they consider. There is no clear hard data for this, but I think what they think is what's called the Pareto optimum condition, which is a optimum condition invented by Wilfred Pareto, the sociologist, Italian, who basically says if the income gap, he says in the condition where the rich still getting fabulous rich, but the poor conditions are still improving. That will be that will be the foundation for continued social stability. But if the gap is too big, meaning if we fall below 7%, that Pareto optimum condition will also fall, which means super rich that continue to get rich. Right? We have one general, top general, whose family, Gaff discovered several tons of gold. I mean, look at this; it's crazy. Corruption case, the most recent case, and then you have the poor people also become poor. Then we have a problem. So the 7% is a political red line, in other words. Okay, that's my interpretation, and several Chinese analysts also agree with me. This is not a public issue, but it is what they're really having this problem. So this is where our future economic crisis could come, because of the political instability caused by that. And so you see, the dealing with corruption campaign is important here, okay? Because the idea is to narrow the gap of income. Now, there are many other problems we're facing. Before since I'm supposed to talk about international issues now, so I'll leave other issues. Demography is going to be another issue, aging population. I just want to point out, we still get about 10 years, less than 10 years of what's called demographic dividend. Then we're entering major crisis. So we have a lot of other problems economically. Now let's look at the challenges for international system, which I think, again, for the first time, Chinese leadership are facing a world which is not congenial to its idea of a peaceful rise or the peaceful development. The neighborhood is not very tranquil. Okay. The last few years, as you know, Chinese seem to be having problems with most of the neighbors. Thank God we still have good relations with Russia. But most other neighbors in the south and the southeast part seem to be we're having major difficulties. Okay. We have territorial disputes, East China Sea. We have territorial disputes, South China Sea, and we have some diplomatic isolation in Asian Pacific. We had a major strategic problem with United States, which started its so-called rebalancing strategy a few years ago under Obama administration. So the question is how the new leadership dealing with this. Now, the usual interpretation is Chinese leadership is more nationalistic. They are more willing to use American think tank language, assertive. The new leadership, they are young, they don't know much about history, they are more aggressive in the sense of inexperience. That is a wrong, in my view, a reading of the leadership quality. I don't think this is something this new leadership really interested in riding nationalism to resolve its own domestic challenges. I think this leadership, in my opinion, knows that nationalism is a tiger. Nationalism is not a horse. It's a tiger. It can take you to a place. It runs very fast, but riding a tiger is also terribly dangerous. The tiger could hurt you with that speed and with the violent attitude. And I personally don't think the new leadership particularly resort to nationalism to solve its international relationships. Now, the basic strategy, in my view, is that they are, first of all, they adopt a strategy of east-looking. It's called a westward strategy by de-emphasizing on the Asian Pacific region, where the water is already muddied from their point of view with the U.S. strategy of strategic containment against China, which, that's what Obama administrations seem to be doing, all the way from Aleutian Island to Kamchatka to Okinawa. When you look at American military deployment, the way they're doing these in diplomatic alliances, all the way down to India, it's what Chinese would call a C-shape containment line against Chinese on the Asian Pacific side, which is already in existence. I'm talking about the new military strategy, air-sea battle. We're talking about the deployment of 60% of the U.S. Navy in West Pacific, the official announcement of maritime, the marine rotation in Darwin, Australia, the coastal battleships for the first time deployed in Singapore. We're talking about the U.S. back to Subic Bay, U.S. Navy back to Cam Bay of Vietnam, then of Myanmar, then Indian Ocean. So this is, from a Chinese point of view, this is a military strategy of containment and a diplomatic strategy. Now, they try to de-emphasize the conflict in the Asian Pacific region. They are moving to the west part, which means they adopt a new strategy known as a continental strategy. That is, build closest relationship with European Union. European Union takes top priority. Historically, Chinese don't understand the European Union. They think it's messy, multilateral, no decision ever made. Chinese, throughout the Cold War period, Chinese reputation, what they call G1 country, because Chinese never like multilateralism. Chinese diplomats, if you ask them in those days, you want to work in UN, Geneva, that's a kiss of death for their career. And today, of course, as you know, this is really the jumping point for a better job if you start with multilateral setting. So, we began to understand the EU since 2003. The reason, the turning point is very simple, because that year it appeared a unexpected diplomatic entente. That is entente led by French, Germans, followed by Moscow and Beijing. We have a four-power entente against Anglo-American war in Iraq. Okay. And that single event convinced Chinese, the West becoming two West. It's not one. So we're willing to deal with EU in a very different way when we're dealing with the United States. And so for 10 years now, the year 2004, internally designated by the Politburo as a year of EU, right? Because that's the immediate result. And for 10-year building, the China-EU relationship has become the closest. First of all, it's the largest economic partner now. Between China and the EU, it's the largest, surpassing the relationship with the US, surpassing it with Japan. Secondly, EU and China has no strategic conflict at all, which is much easier to deal with each other. There's nothing that can be considered a strategic problem. We actually invite the Europeans to come to Asia. We always, complain, why EU not be seeing six-party talks on Korea? Why the EU is not seeing in the South China Sea, all these disputes. East China Sea, EU are very good at those kind of territorial and historic disputes. Okay. So that's one bridge we built on the continental strategy. The second bridge Chinese been building is with Russia. As we all know, what happened last year. Well, it's already been built, this very close relation. China and Russia never really trusted each other in history. They hate each other. They never got along. And since Catherine the Great, these two nations really don't have an amicable relationship, I would argue. But nevertheless, they managed to resolve most of their outstanding problems, including territorial disputes. We have more than 7,000 territorial disputes. For very patient diplomacy, only 7.5 left. Mr. Putin always complained. What I heard is why nobody give him a Nobel Peace Prize, because it's a quiet diplomacy, negotiation, very patient between Chinese and the Russians for over 20-year period. Then we have an economy supplement each other. We need what they sell, they need what we sell. And the third most important part is we both have a common problem with the United States, so we have a strategic partnership there. But I don't think we're going to have an alliance. We had a bad experience with the Russians in the 50s. Nobody wants to go back to alliance system. Okay. So this is how the Chinese grand, foreign policy strategy is doing. Then, of course, since we are running, we're running out of time. I simply want to emphasize the other parts of the world, including this part of the world, becoming increasingly more important. The BRICS countries. When BRICS was created, nobody take it seriously. Nobody think it's going to be serious because it's so diversified political system, foreign policy agenda. Nobody ever thought they're going to ever develop a common agenda or even help each other. Nobody ever thought they're going to have a bank. It's unthinkable at the beginning. But somehow, I think the countries of the BRICS seem to find a common ground, and I think the most important thing for BRICS, from a Chinese point of view, not just the economic development purposes, but also Chinese believe the BRICS countries share some common views on global governance, which is different from the Western views of the basic principles of global governance. Okay. On many issues. I'm not saying they don't. International current monetary system being one, international development strategy, okay. And many other geopolitical issues as well. Okay. So this is why I think the Chinese are paying enormous attention to BRICS countries, and they are very much active now, also in Latin America in general. Now here I want to emphasize my last point is Latin America versus Africa, what Chinese doing there. Now, with Africa, Chinese know Africa. We've been there in the 60s. These days, under Mao's rather crazy concept of foreign policy, we are exporting revolution to Africa because the newly, decolonized African countries, they need us. We want to encourage them to fight against the West. And we are providing a lot of free aid to Africans in the 60s and 70s. Okay. But then we left Africa. Now we come back again. The new century, the Chinese becomes very successful penetrating African countries. And this time, of course, Chinese are not offering free aid anymore. Okay. So they not only want the resources, but also they want to penetrate deeper into African economy. But since they've been there, they know how to operate in Africa much better than know Latin America. Latin America, I think the problem is that Chinese has no sense, because during the Cold War period, Chinese tried also export revolution. I know Latin America has a lot of Maoists, but Mao never believed the foreign Maoists can be really revolutionary. And when André Malraux, de Gaulle's advisor to visit Mao in the 60s, he tell Mao in French, he says, 1968, we have a lot of Maoists in Paris, they're on street. Mao said, if I were you, I put all the Maoists into prison. Now the basic point is he does not believe Chinese experience can be copied by other, no matter who they are outside. So there is no sense. But we actually want to export the revolution to Latin America, but there is no chance. It cannot. That's a Monroe Doctrine. American can never allow. So we don't have any serious contact with Latin America until the Nixon and the Kissinger breakthrough in the 70s. Then Chinese began to pay attention in the 90s to Latin America, but more for political reasons, not much economic activities, even the early 90s. One of the reasons Chinese interest in Latin America is Pinochet of Chile. Chinese love Pinochet in the early 90s. You probably don't realize we even have a wonderful, affectionate nickname for Mr. Pinochet. We call him Old P. And this is a party elite talking. Why? Because Pinochet was able to transform a very authoritarian dictatorship into, peacefully transformed into a kind of, more open society and economy under Pinochet. You see, this is the elite at that time. I'm talking about our political elite who are reformers who said this is experience we may learn from. Actually, there is a chance for a peaceful transformation from a one-party dictatorship into something new. Then, of course, or give up the idea. Then we realized Latin American economy. We used to love Latin American experience in economic development. Then we realized it's a bad example. Okay. So this is where. So then we lost interest again. Until the end of the century. Because that's our new policy. President Cardoso is very much involved. The Chinese are what's called going out strategy at that time. Going out meaning we cannot rely upon international market for oil, for getting our supply of raw material oil. We have to go there to the place where actually they have the resources. Here we talk about Latin America, we talk about Venezuela, we talk about Brazil, we're talking about Africa. Okay. So that changed the direction. The Chinese become so far so good. They're very successful in Latin America, and with Brazilian story, of course, is fabulous. 10 years ago, when Fernando Hickey told me, saying we are actually selling Brazilian small airplane to China. I said, no, I cannot believe this. You have airplane companies? I didn't believe that at that point. Then I found out, yes. But today, of course, you can see Brazil-China economic tie. It's really the major relationship now. It's a top one. So I think the Chinese are having a global strategy, try to resolve their tensions with the immediate neighborhood, including the United States. Now, can they be successful by doing so, to divert this tension away? Personally, I don't think so. They still have to deal with the real problem, the Asian Pacific region. They have to adapt themselves to a new international phenomenon that is, despite the Chinese pronouncement of peaceful intentions, when China is too big for one region, this is a reality. That its existence, it automatically creates some kind of fear and imbalance. Chinese are not very sensitive on that issues. Our foreign minister in the Hanoi conference, foreign minister ASEAN conference, when the Singaporeans argue with us, our foreign minister at the time, in my view, made huge mistakes by using the language saying, well, China is a big country, you are too small. That kind of language is not helping, in my view. It's a stupid kind of way of talking. And, let me finish another anecdote. In the 1990s in Geneva, when the Denmark foreign minister attacking Chinese for human rights, a Chinese diplomat basically telling him shut up, saying small country having a big mouth. Those kind of insensitivity. China is now, they should learn how to make the neighbors feel secure and safe. This is something they, for many, many years, they have not learned yet. So this is something they have to learn, and they have to learn how to deal with the United States. But with the United States, the story is far more complicated and difficult. I think I'll stop here. I'm very happy to get questions. Yes. Thank you.